This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter, Chairman of the NYSE Governance Services, Corporate Board Member, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the show. We have a past guest back, and we're happy, Pat. We haven't seen you in a while.
It's been a while, TK.
Yes, but it's a pleasure to have you back. Pat McGurn is the Special Counsel for the Institutional Shareholder Services, more commonly known as the ISS proxy advisory firm, who obviously has a big impact on boards, and that's why you're here. We're here to talk about something that you have introduced previously but made some enhancements. It's called the ISS QuickScore 2.0. So Pat, interestingly, we still get questions about QuickScore, and we've gone through a series for the years and years that you and I have worked together with the quotient and the ratio, and there's other things, and now we're at the QuickScore, and now we're at 2.0. So I think it's best if you start explaining what QuickScore is as far as a product, sort of how you guys use it, and then again, this year you've introduced some new sort of variables, if you could touch on those.
Sure. I always start off by talking about client demand, and institutional investors increasingly look to everything from involving governance in their investment decisions to engaging with boards of directors, and in some instances proxy voting by looking at a more holistic view of the governance practices at a firm. So rather than looking at the singular ballot item or looking at screens of performance when they're selecting a stock at the and especially when they're getting ready to meet with the board of directors through engagement, they want the big picture. And so what QuickScore does is provide them at a glance, but then with drill downs into more information, a way of putting a company's corporate governance practices into perspective. I think in particular, we look at governance risk. We try to assess factors looking at the company's board structure, their shareholder rights, their audit processes, and their compensation to allow our clients a view into the overall governance structure at that company and perhaps get a picture in the boardroom as well as what the driving incentives are for that company. 2.0 is just the latest enhancement. It means we added some additional data points, we changed the scoring methodology, and notably, we also went to real-time updating. I know we're going to talk about data verification later on, but it's very important. Investors want not just set it and forget it once a year updates of information in QuickScore. They want it real time, event driven. So we're looking to company filings, putting that information into the QuickScore and then recalculating on a daily basis.
I know one of the new things, I think there were 4 new sort of features, and then there were some other factors that you had built in, which isn't part of the numerical score. It was almost like these are things that we want everybody to be aware of. But one of the new factors that is part of the score is this board tenure, and I know this has some question to it. Certainly we've had those questions. There's sort of if we look across the world, we've seen other parts of the world set up almost like term limits or periods of time when somebody's independence. So they certainly share some of that, and I'll ask you in a minute. At the same time, we on the show have been, and this sort of touches on that, we on the show have been huge fans of sort of refreshment of boards, okay? This certainly touches on that. And let me give you some information, and then I'm curious to have you sort of talk about the tenure issue just a little bit, just so our viewers can understand the thought process, because I think it is deeper than what it might appear on the surface. But in our annual boardroom survey, which we do with Spencer Stewart, I'm sure you've seen it in the magazine, but we asked the question, how important is it for good governance to periodically refresh the board with new blood? Interestingly enough, more than 2/3 of the people either said it was important or critically important to refresh boards, and another 26% said that it was somewhat important. That means only 7% of all the directors that we surveyed, which was well over 1,000, said that refreshing the board wasn't important. Okay, that's sort of good news for us all. It's good news for us because we're a proponent of it. I think that gets to the heart of what, the board tenure criteria that you're looking at. Then we ask the question, okay, so if you believe that refreshing's good, what's the best way to go about it? 25% said term limits. Okay, we know that there's some pushback, on that. 49% chose mandatory age requirements. That's probably the easiest and most popular way to sort of gracefully get people off the board, although it doesn't address whether somebody's contributing or not. But here's the thing that really surprised me, Pat. 85% said that the board evaluation process is the best way to get refresh boards and get non-performers off the boards. Now, that number alone makes you and I very happy, okay, because I think that's the proper way to do it. 85% if somebody wasn't contributing and getting off the board, ISS or an institutional investor would be happy, from that perspective. But the problem with this is we know that in that 85% and maybe 95% do board evaluations, very, very few of them take that information and then do what's right with it, meaning ask somebody to actually leave the board. And we've seen in our research that almost 33% of existing board members thinks there's somebody that should be replaced on the board. So all of that is this huge lead-in to this director tenure situation. And it isn't, in the perfect world, wouldn't you like this to be more than just an independence thing for the average age that you've put in? Aren't we trying to strive towards the whole issue of board refreshment?
I think our institutional clients share both your concern but your passion on this topic. Board refreshment has gone from being a non-issue to being perhaps the number one or number two issue out there on the governance front these days. I think we have surveyed our institutional clients to see what's behind this concern, and it's joint. Some of it is independence. They worry that long tenured directors may lose their independence over time. That's somewhat supported by academic literature, other empirical studies, but some cut against that. They actually say if it's not the same CEO who appointed you, you actually get more independent over time simply because you've been around and you understand the company's business better. Others look at it as a problem of refreshment, I think, and I think that's where our concern lies. We have started up a long-term policy consultation on the tenure issue. Before we change our policies in any way or our classifications of directors based upon tenure, we want to get a 360 discussion going amongst institutional investors, directors, executives, and other interested parties. In the meantime, because we know our clients are concerned, we added a board refreshment feature to QuickScore 2.0. We're not focused on term limits per se or even tenure per se. We want to find situations and help our clients to identify companies where there may be a substantial proportion of directors who have been in office for a considerable amount of time. We picked 9 years as being the dividing line because that's the rule that affects independence in some European markets. It's also something that resonates with our clients. They understand it. They invest in those markets. They're familiar with it. So what we measure are the percentage of directors on a board who have served 9 years or more. And I apologize going to the numbers here, but at the S&P 500, we found that there are 20% of boards where 60% or more of the directors have 9-year tenures or longer. I think when you expand that to the Russell 3000 universe x the S&P 500, it becomes 25% of boards have directors with have 60% of their directors with 9-year tenures or greater. You look at that as being a driver of board age and board tenure. Over the last couple years, we've seen the average age of directors go from around 60, where it had stayed for a very long time, to 62, and then last year to 63. At this rate, it's going to go straight through 65 and above if it's unchecked. We're also seeing tenure back in 2007, and the average tenure at Russell 3000 companies was 8.7 years. Last year, it was 10.8. So we're seeing almost a percentage point a year or a year-over-year increase in tenure simply because we're not seeing that turnover in boardrooms and refreshment. So rather than adopting a preference for term limits or mandatory retirement ages or other moves, we're trying to get people to think about the issue and address it and see where it might be a concern. And I think putting it into QuickScore 2.0 raises the probability that it'll show up as a point of conversation when our institutional investor clients are speaking with boards of directors or management teams.
Well, it's nice to hear that we're really talking about the bigger issue, because actually we have problems on both ends. We have people that are going on the board in their 30s who could serve 40 years
Sure.
on the board. And is there anybody out there that think that that would be a normal thing? I don't think so. I think it would be good to have some kind of situation that somebody isn't, because in that case, somebody could be 40 and have served their 9 years on that. So anyway, the important thing here is I think there is, as you say, a focused look at board refreshment as a whole, skill sets, age, independence, all that stuff, which should be favorable in more effective boards.
And tenure is an element of diversity. You want a nice spread of tenures in the boardroom. You don't want to see all the directors who were appointed 20 years ago, but likewise, you don't want to see all the board members having been appointed in the last 12 months. You want to see a balance, sort of like laddering, where you want to see directors at varying tenure levels spread throughout the boardroom roster. I think that leads to the best mix of perspectives, backgrounds, and also brings people closer to their period of full-time employment. Don't forget, when you're looking at boards today, the #1 feeder group for new directorships are retirees. So by definition, many of them are already starting to move when they join the board away from their direct industry experience. And so this is one way to help boards potentially put that in their thinking cap when they're looking to refresh their boardroom skill sets.
That's a great segue to my next question, because one of the factors, I guess you call them review factors, in the 2.0, and review factor means it's not being put into the numerical part, but you want people to be aware of that, is on diversity. And you and I have diversity of thought is very critical to us. You just gave a good segue to it, talking about why diversity is important. The only thing I want to ask you, which was interesting, your review factor only dealt with gender, okay? It said that here's what we want you to be aware of as it relates to gender. How come sort of you left out the ethnicity or the racial part of that, which typically when we talk about diverse boards seem to go hand in hand? So question to the ISS is, why just gender, not sort of talking about it ethnically as well?
Sure, a couple of issues. First of all, we want to put this metric in place for all markets that we cover in QuickScore. And so that means a lot of global markets where the level of disclosure on ethnicity, I think, can be meager, and it's more difficult to assign sometimes scores out on diversity measures related to ethnicity on that basis. We're working on that, but what we're seeing a lot of demand for from our institutional clients right now is real-time data on gender diversity, and that applies to the European markets, to Asia, to the US marketplace. And so I think we'll get to all the broad range of diversity issues once we can get past some of the disclosure gaps, but this is one area where we could go ahead and provide fairly robust data right now. As to why it's not scored, I don't think there's consensus in our client base as to how it should be scored to date, so we're still interfacing with institutional investors to try and gauge what sort of weighting it should be given, but it's clearly something that's top of mind for our clients, and it's almost an embarrassment. I'm going to go to the numbers again here, so I apologize, but when we look at the Russell 3000 universe x the S&P 500, so taking those large cap companies out of place, 39% of that universe have 0 women, and we're talking here in the U.S. on their boards. I think it's almost a source of embarrassment, I think, for people who've been in the governance process and the community as long as we have, TK, that we're still talking about potentially 40% of boards at middle market and small cap companies not having a single woman on their board of directors. And we're seeing gender diversity being addressed in some global markets with quotas and other mechanisms. I think we're trying to fight against that here in the U.S. marketplace by urging voluntary movement. But ultimately, if people aren't looking at the data and talking about it and engaging, which I hope that they do because we've included in the data in the database for QuickScore, the issue is not going to be resolved short of bringing, once again, government into the process, which is something I don't think any of us want to see.
Yeah, I'm actually encouraged. This year is the first year I've seen any movement on the numbers from the gender perspective. But again, one of the things that I'm hopeful of is that we look at that as diversity of thought. That's gender, that's ethnicity, that's whatever. I mean, that's the kind of representation that you want on your board. You serve Hispanics, you serve, blacks, you have a broad range, gender and racial. So happy that there's progress, not unhappy that it's not being measured. I think bringing to light is the important part at this point, and hopefully we'll find a solution to the other part of the number reporting.
Yeah, better disclosure, engagement, these are the keys to, I think, bringing this issue in front of people. And when it's placed in front of a board trying to justify why they don't have diversity of any sort, I think it tends to hit home, and it's something that boards quite often will take action on after it's been raised by a substantial number of their investors.
Yeah, and that's why I think we'll see movement. I really do. I think there's been so many people in this space that I think that you whack somebody enough with a 2x4 and eventually they sort of get it. So last question, Pat, and this is for the benefit, I think, of both the ISS and the companies. It is important that you had mentioned about the online updating. It is important that companies go and look at what's created for their specific company, look for errors or gaps or anything like that. They should be thinking of over-reporting, not under-reporting. Talk a little bit about the importance of each company making sure that their information is correct within the QuickScore.
Sure. One feature we've always had built into any ratings methodology we've put forward at ISS is a data verification opportunity for corporate issuers. I think it's a free access situation, so you come in, you get a password and a login. I think you can come in and see what we list for all the various data elements. And what we found over time is sometimes companies think they're disclosing information, but they aren't, or they aren't bringing the information to the forefront. They're burying it in some regulatory filing they're making with the SEC. Now, we're pouring through all those filings on a daily basis, but I think it does help to have the companies come in and augment and check that data to make sure that what we're putting in front of our institutional clients is going to be the most up-to-date information and most reliable information possible. So out of the Russell 3000 universe, we've already had about 1,200 companies come in and utilize that data verification process. We're hoping that companies do it on a regular basis because, as I mentioned before, when we're real-time updating, it means that any change that you make in your governance practices is going to be rescored on a daily basis. And so that could change, given the relative nature of the ratings scoring methodology, the ultimate score that the company's getting.
Well, 1,200 is a number that's bigger than I thought it would be, but that leaves 1,800 that have not gone in there out of the 3,000, the Russell 3000, to get in there and take a look at that information. So it's important. It's important for the companies to do that. So, well, listen, Pat, as always, great to have you on this week, and we're happy that you were able to carve out the time. So we'll have you back again. And with that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week with another topic to help you be a better board member or committee member. We'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom. Brought to you by NYSE Governance Services, Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.